Why can't the West leave the Sahel alone? Time and again, when it isn't a Western nation pointing its finger at Mali, it's a Western organization aiming accusations at Burkina Faso. Recently, the spotlight fell on Flore-Smereczniak, the United Nations ambassador to Burkina Faso and a citizen of Mauritius, who released a report that landed like a hammer blow. In it, she accused the Burkinabé army of some of the most damning crimes imaginable, recruiting child soldiers, committing acts of sexual violence, and even murdering civilians. The report sparked outrage and debate, but Traoré's response was swift and uncompromising. He ordered her out of the country. To his supporters, this was a moment of defiance, a leader standing up against what they see as constant Western interference and slander. To his critics, it was the opposite, a dangerous dismissal of accountability, a refusal to answer tough questions. And yet, the deeper question lingers. Why did Traoré make this decision? Was it simply an attempt to silence criticism, or was it a calculated move to shield Burkina Faso from outside forces determined to weaken its sovereignty? The answer lies in understanding the long history of suspicion, mistrust, and power struggles that have defined the relationship between the Sahel and the West. August 18th, 2025. Burkina Faso makes a dramatic announcement to the world. Flore-Smereczniak, the United Nations ambassador stationed in Ouagadougou, has been declared persona non grata. In simple terms, she has been expelled, sent packing out of the country. The decision sent shockwaves across diplomatic circles. But why? The answer traces back months earlier, to March of the same year. Carol had drafted a controversial United Nations report titled Children and Armed Conflict in Burkina Faso. It was not just another bureaucratic document, it was a damning indictment. Covering the years 2022 to 2024, the report cataloged more than 2,000 cases of horror. Child soldiers being recruited, killings carried out, sexual violence, and systematic abuse. According to her report, the perpetrators were not only the Islamist insurgents that have plagued the Sahel for more than a decade, but also the very forces meant to defend the nation, Burkina Faso's army, and its civilian defense volunteers, known as the VDP. The accusations were devastating. For the Burkinabé leadership, they were more than allegations. They were a direct strike at the image of a country already fighting for survival, already struggling against an endless insurgency. And for President Ibrahim Traoré, they crossed a red line. So the ambassador was expelled, a move praised by some as a bold stand against Western meddling and condemned by others as an attempt to silence uncomfortable truths. But the real question still lingers. Was this about defending national pride or hiding a deeper, darker reality? According to the Burkinabé authorities, the United Nations report was flawed from the very beginning. They claimed the UN never even consulted them before publishing such damaging allegations. In their view, the report was not only one-sided, it was built on shaky ground. Officials in Ouagadougou argued that the document lacked hard evidence, no legal rulings, no verifiable proof to support the accusations pinned against what they call their valiant Burkinabé fighters. And so, in the eyes of the government, the decision was simple. If an ambassador delivers unfounded claims without respect for due process, she must go. But this raises the larger question: who is wrong and who is right? To the Burkinabé leadership, this wasn't just about one report, it was about a pattern. Since the military governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger came to power, they have become constant targets of Western media, NGOs, and so-called human rights organizations. The timing, they argue, is not coincidental. Think about it. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not the only African nations wrestling with insurgencies and instability. Across the continent, Nigeria continues to battle Boko Haram. Chad faces recurring rebellions. Ghana, Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, the list goes on. Each of these countries faces violence, corruption, displacement, and tragedy. And in each of them, their national armies are on the front lines, fighting as best they can. Yet here is the paradox. When the spotlight of Western criticism shines, it seems to beam most brightly on only 3 countries: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Again and again, these nations are accused of atrocities, murder, sexual violence, even genocide. The question is, why? Why is it only these armies that dominate the headlines while the struggles of their neighbors often slip quietly into the background? Is it coincidence? Or is there a bigger strategy at play? You see, there is clearly a narrative being pushed, a story crafted and repeated by Western organizations against the three Sahel nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And when you look closer, the cracks begin to show. Let's take this latest report. Where is the proof? Where is the real, verifiable evidence that the Burkinabé army recruits children as soldiers? Where is the proof that its soldiers deliberately murder innocent children? Where is the evidence of systematic sexual assault against minors? These are the very questions the Burkinabé authorities have thrown back at the United Nations. And here's the thing, this isn't the first time such accusations have surfaced. A few months ago, Western media outlets published sensational stories accusing the Burkinabé army of killing children. They even included images. 3 or 4 young boys, lifeless on the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets. For many readers abroad, those images were enough to convict Burkina Faso in the court of public opinion. But what those articles left out was the context. Those boys had been recruited by jihadist groups. They were armed, trained, and then sent to kill civilians in their homes and fields. In other words, they weren't innocent bystanders. They were tragic victims themselves. Children exploited, brainwashed, and turned into weapons of terror. Yet in the way the story was told, the blame was laid squarely at the feet of the Burkinabé army. On one side, Western institutions presenting themselves as guardians of human rights. On the other, Sahel governments who insist that the narrative is not only misleading, but dangerous, because it paints the very armies holding the line against terrorism as villains in their own homeland. And for Traoré and his allies, that is unacceptable. Clearly, those young boys had been killed in the chaos of fighting jihadists. They were victims of a war they never chose, dragged into battle by extremists who used them as human shields. But instead of giving the world an accurate account of how these tragedies unfolded, the so-called human rights reports shaped the narrative differently. They framed it in a way that suggested the Burkinabé army was deliberately hunting down and killing children. Now, think for a moment about the image this creates in the minds of international readers. An army not seen as a force of defense, but as an army of child killers. And this isn't the first time such reports have carried consequences beyond Burkina Faso's borders. A similar publication, pushed by Western media and human rights organizations, stirred anger among the Burkinabé diaspora in France. Suddenly, protests erupted in Paris and other cities, with citizens demonstrating against Traoré's administration. The power of words and carefully chosen images had crossed oceans, reshaping perceptions and turning communities against their own government. According to that particular report, the Burkinabé army, under President Ibrahim Traoré, was not simply fighting terrorists. It claimed the army was targeting one specific ethnic group, the Fulani. Entire villages, the report alleged, were being wiped out. The word they used was heavy, almost impossible to ignore: genocide. In simple terms, according to the Western narrative, Traoré had shifted from fighting extremists to exterminating his own people. And just like that, the fight against terrorism was rebranded in Western headlines as a war against the Fulani people of Burkina Faso. There is no doubt that stories like these shake even the strongest supporters. They paint a chilling picture of Ibrahim Traoré, not as a reformer, not as a defender of his people, but as a monster. A frustrated, power-hungry leader who, in his desperation, has supposedly turned his fury inward on his own citizens. These reports create resentment, fuel anger, and slowly erode trust in the military authorities of Burkina Faso. With headlines like this, people forget every school built, every community defended, every road repaired under Traoré's leadership. Instead, they see only blood and blame. And this is exactly why the Burkinabé diaspora in France took to the streets, calling for his exit. But here's where the story doesn't add up. If entire Fulani communities were truly being wiped out, why haven't the people inside Burkina Faso raised the alarm? Why is it that such explosive accusations originate not from eyewitnesses on the ground, but from journalists sitting comfortably in Paris, London, or Washington? Why do these claims come from voices that have never set foot in the villages they claim to defend? And if they have never been in the country, then where exactly is their evidence coming from? Now, of course, some people will argue, but Traoré suppresses free speech. He arrests anyone who dares to criticize his government. And yes, that claim has been repeated many times. But let's be realistic here. If Ibrahim Traoré was truly orchestrating a campaign to wipe out the Fulani people, do you honestly believe such an atrocity could be hidden? Not in today's world, not in the age of smartphones and instant uploads. Burkina Faso may still struggle with development, but make no mistake, there are countless educated citizens with access to technology. If entire communities were being wiped out, we would have seen the evidence. Photos, videos, testimonies flooding the internet. But instead, what we have is a story born far away from Ouagadougou, amplified in Parisian newsrooms and by so-called NGOs with vague reports and carefully chosen language. They tell us they have anonymous sources. Yet when you dig deeper, there are no faces, no raw footage, no verifiable witnesses, just emotional words strung together, designed to provoke outrage. And on the rare occasion when a witness is presented, it is often someone with an agenda, a political opponent living in exile, or a voice that's been paid to repeat a narrative. Other times, these so-called sources are nothing more than unverified accounts pulled from the internet or diaspora activists posting from abroad. This is the pattern. Dramatic accusations, but no concrete evidence. Heavy words like genocide dropped into headlines, but never supported by undeniable proof. And in the absence of evidence, the narrative becomes not about facts, but about perception. Think about it. If there truly was a credible witness to claims of genocide, do you really believe the foreign media would hide their identity? Of course not. They would plaster that testimony across every headline, every screen, every platform available. This constant excuse of anonymous sources, it isn't protection, it's a loophole, a convenient shield that allows unverified words to be treated as fact. Here's how the pattern works. First, they gather a collection of emotional but unsubstantiated statements. Then they wrap it up with a headline designed to pull at heartstrings and ignite outrage. Finally, they add the classic call for an international investigation, because that is always the end game. International intervention, external control. Take, for example, a recent publication by the outlet Genocide Watch. Its headline screamed, "Burkina Faso army accused of torturing and killing civilians." The article went further, quoting an NGO official and what it called a local source, both speaking anonymously to AFP. According to them, Burkina Faso's military and allied militias massacred Fulani civilians in a retaliatory attack in the country's west. The report alleged that whole families of Fulani shepherds were killed in the bushes of Solenzo, in the Bema and Ban areas. It even claimed the death toll numbered in the dozens. To add weight, the article referenced disturbing online videos. Bloodied bodies, including women, children, and the elderly, lying on the ground, some with their hands and feet bound. Dramatic? Absolutely. Emotional? Without a doubt. But here's the question that lingers. Where is the verifiable evidence? Who are these anonymous sources? Who recorded these so-called videos and under what circumstances? And most importantly, why is it that these stories always emerge from Western platforms, while the voices of the people actually living in Burkina Faso remain conspicuously absent? The narrative painted a grim sequence of events. Earlier in March, jihadists had attacked the area. In response, locals accused the Fulani of sheltering those responsible and demanded they leave before retaliation came. But as the Fulani fled, the story claims, they were captured by soldiers and volunteer fighters. Instead of being spared, they were tortured and then executed. The article ended with a chilling conclusion. A so-called human rights official, speaking to AFP, claimed to have verified the footage. Their words were damning. The massacre, they said, was not random. It aligned with what they described as the Burkinabé military's ongoing strategy, a deliberate campaign of targeting Fulani civilians in retaliation for terrorist attacks. Once again, a single narrative was pushed into the world, that the Burkinabé army, under Traoré's leadership, was not fighting terrorism, but carrying out systematic ethnic killings. And once again, the story relied on shaky pillars, anonymous voices, unverifiable videos, and claims that no one inside the country itself has confirmed. No doubt, anyone who read that article would come away with a dark image of Burkina Faso's leaders and its army. The words alone are enough to stain reputations and twist perceptions. But anyone willing to think critically can see the holes in the story. The article claimed that circulating videos showed Burkinabé militias standing over corpses, hurling insults at Fulani men, women, and children. Powerful imagery, if true. But here's the question. If those videos really exist, why weren't they included? Not in the article, not as links, not even as screenshots. In fact, not a single Western outlet that ran this story showed the supposed footage. So, what are we left with? References to unseen evidence, a narrative without proof. Some may argue that the videos were simply too graphic, but that excuse doesn't hold water. Graphic content has never stopped the media before. Time and time again, Western outlets have published war zone images, beheadings, bombings, mutilated bodies, always with a warning label or a blurred thumbnail. If they truly had the evidence, they would have published it. Because in journalism, shocking images don't stay buried, they go viral. Yet here, in the case of Burkina Faso, nothing. No video, no proof, just words. And that silence speaks louder than anything. Secondly, let's look at another major flaw in that article. It claimed that a so-called human rights official had verified the video and declared with confidence that the massacre aligned with the military's ongoing strategy of targeting Fulani civilians in retaliation. Strong words. But stop and think. Who exactly was this official? Why wasn't his or her name ever mentioned? How did they verify the footage? Was there an investigation? Was there forensic analysis? Or was it simply another opinion passed off as fact? These questions remain unanswered, and without answers, what we're left with is not truth. It's hearsay dressed up as journalism. Yet, instead of investigating the credibility of these claims, every major Western media outlet rushed to publish the story. And leading the charge, as always, was the so-called independent watchdog, Human Rights Watch, an organization that presents itself as impartial, standing guard over abuses around the world. But what happens when the watchdog itself becomes compromised? What happens when it begins to amplify unverified accusations rather than scrutinize them? If Human Rights Watch were truly independent, if it were truly committed to facts, it would have demanded real proof. It would have verified the pictures and tracked the origins of the so-called videos. It would have investigated on the ground, speaking directly to witnesses within Burkina Faso, not relying on shadowy sources from abroad. But instead, it published, and in doing so, added legitimacy to a narrative that may be built on nothing more than lies. And that is the danger. Because once such a narrative spreads, once it is stamped with the seal of an organization that claims neutrality, it stops being questioned. It becomes truth in the eyes of the world. But why create this false narrative in the first place? The answer is simple. The military government of Burkina Faso has become a thorn in the side of France and the West. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Ouagadougou has cut off decades of unfettered Western access, cheap resources, military bases, and influence in the Sahel. Traoré's anti-West stance has not only embarrassed Paris, but also weakened its grip over a region it once considered its backyard. And of course, France is furious. But history tells us one thing. They are never the type to simply take such humiliation quietly. Now ask yourself, why is it only Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that dominate these negative headlines? Why not other African nations also battling insurgencies? Nigeria is drowning in conflict with Boko Haram. Chad has faced rebellions for years. Guinea is under military rule. The Democratic Republic of Congo has been bleeding for decades. Yet none of these governments are labeled genocidal, none accused of systematic slaughter on the scale Western media pins on the Sahel's AES bloc. And here lies the truth. It has nothing to do with the fact that Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani lead military governments. Guinea is run by soldiers. And Chad itself was long ruled by a military strongman before being converted into a civilian presidency. They are spared the constant accusations because they still bend, in one way or another, toward Western influence. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger do not. This is the pattern. Leaders and countries that dare to defy the West, that challenge its control, are met with relentless campaigns of demonization. They are targeted with narratives designed to turn their own people against them, to paint them as tyrants, warlords, even genocidaires. And if history has shown us anything, it is that once such a picture has been painted, the end game is always the same: regime change.